All right. Well, hello. My name is Brenna, and I figured that we'd just introduce ourselves and our organization. So I'll start. I'm Brenna. I'm the Director of Education and Advocacy at Pasado Safe Haven, and we are a Washington-based nonprofit with a mission to end animal cruelty. And that's through a very comprehensive approach through different programs that start with investigations and rescue and include education of our youth, and then also advocating for laws on behalf of animals. And I'll turn it over to Mindy so she can introduce herself and her organization.
Hi, my name is Mindy Callison, and I'm the founder and executive director of Bailing Out Benji. We're a national nonprofit organization that exists to educate about the puppy mill industry and the cruelty that goes on within it. We also work very hard to pass legislation across the country to end puppy mill sales through pet stores. We have a chapter right in Washington who's very active and partners with Pasado constantly in order to create local change.
That's
Great.
amazing.
James.
Hi, my name is James Evans. I'm the CEO and founder of CARE, Companions and Animals for Reform and Equity. CARE is also a national organization. Our primary focus is advocating for more voices of color in the industry, everywhere in the industry, and also advocating for more positive narratives for people of color, because so often, we see photographs and films on animal welfare websites and in Hollywood, and very rarely do they include people of color. And so we're very narrative based. We also do a lot of research on the matter of equity in the field. And also, obviously, employment is really important to us, seeing more people of color being employed in the animal welfare field.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this call. And honestly, what CARE is doing is super inspirational and so very much needed, especially now. And definitely animal welfare organizations can have so much to learn from your amazing work that you're doing. What we're talking about today is focused in Washington State. We actually have introduced something called the Humane Pet Sales Bill, and that has been introduced by Pasado Safe Haven with support from our friends at Bailing Out Benji and of course the Humane Society of the United States. And this is legislation that is specifically focused on ending the retail sale of dogs and cats in pet stores here in Washington. And as I said, this is called the Humane Pet Sales Bill. So along with the well-documented history of connection to puppy mills, puppy and kitten selling pet stores have a lot of serious consumer protection issues, especially right now, actually, in light of COVID-19. A lot of these pet stores are using schemes like saying, get your quarantine buddy, bring a new family member into your household. And of course, the consumers, that's what they're looking for. People are looking for a furry family member right now more than ever. But one thing that we found in talking to one local veterinarian who said that they've actually seen a 300% uptick in animals coming in that have come from bad breeding practices, have conditions that have systemically come from places like puppy mills and bad breeding practices. And again, that's coming with this high demand for pets right now. One thing that we've also found is these pet stores here in Washington have been taking advantage of consumers through predatory financing as well. Luckily here in Washington, we passed legislation that ended the leasing of dogs and cats, but they still have financing schemes. And these financing schemes have hugely high interest rates that leave families on the hook for thousands of dollars. And this really impacts a lot of low-income communities who are, of course, seeking for their own furry family member as well. Here in Washington, we also had a stay home, stay healthy order for the first 2 months of the pandemic. And we actually had pet stores here in Washington that defied that order and imported over 150 puppies from out of state to their pet stores and sold them to the public in just a 2-month period. So a lot of different issues that are going on here in relation to consumer protection, as well as the welfare of these puppies, of course. This is actually an issue that is being looked at across the country. We've already had 3 states pass similar bills to this, and there's been 360 localities across the nation that have passed similar legislation. So we're really hoping that Washington can look at this and really make a change and tackle this issue here in our state. However, recent events have also required institutions of all kinds to look at things as they connect to structural bias and racism. And that's something that we very much want to do with this legislation as well. We know that the animal welfare industry is not exempt from structural bias and racism in any way. So we just want to make sure that as we go and take charge of this issue here in Washington, that we're looking at all the different lenses and we're really looking at this bill in an equitable way. So I'd love to hear from you, James, about some of your thoughts around that, some of your experiences, especially as it relates to your organization, CARE.
Yeah, well, thank you. You guys are doing great work. I'm just learning about your organization. I know Mindy's already. Mindy is a rock star. And so in a previous life, I ran a communications firm that was partnered with HSUS. And so we actually did significant national research on puppy mills. And so it's not new to me, the subject matter. I don't think that pet stores per se are abhorrent, right? But puppy mills are certainly abhorrent, right? And so I think what you're doing to me is well within the frame of consumer protection, right? And there's nothing more anti-racist than consumer protection, because you're not protecting just white consumers, right? Or green consumers, you're protecting everyone. And so, to me, there's nothing more equitable than that. That is, to me, what legislation ought to be, something that everybody can take advantage of. And so because everyone coming into a pet store is very likely to be a victim of a pet store, right? That means everyone is going to benefit from the legislation that you're trying to push forward. And that, to me, that's what equitable legislation ought to look like, something that is going to affect everyone across the board, right? So, historically, I've had a cadre of employees, and one of my employees, and this is while we were working on the puppy mill research, she realized that in doing the research that she had purchased a puppy mill dog, and she was a woman of color who was new to the dog purchasing world. Very typically, people of color who are underserved adopt and rescue from each other. It happens in the neighborhood. But as people of color are getting better jobs and making more money, that pet acquisition process looks different. And so, turning to a pet store uninformed, just like other people do, I think is very likely to happen. And to me, there is nothing worse that can happen. Is one, to go to a pet store when there's so many amazing adoptable animals out there. There's really absolutely, in general, for no reason for anyone to be purchasing from a pet store. That said, I think it's even more dangerous for people of color, particularly people of color who don't have a family history of pet acquisition that way, right? Because the whole process will be new to them. And I see that a lot, right? It's these ads are running, they look cute, it looks like the thing to do. You walk in the store, there's a cute and cuddly feeling. And to be honest, right, there's so many people, regardless of ethnicity or social economic standing, that don't understand the relationship between pet stores and puppy mills. And so I think that's especially true for those folks that are coming to it without generational knowledge of the process, and that would be people of color. So I think it's a more hideous in that way because most people of color are not familiar with that buying process historically, right? And so with the predatory lending, these horrible schemes where you're forced to use a vet, my employee was left with thousands and thousands of dollars of vet bills. We kept encouraging her to just switch vets and break the contract, but she was so unfamiliar and so naive in the process that she ended up sticking with it. She didn't have money for legal counsel, and so she stuck in there and ended up paying, I think it was somewhere around $5,000. We helped her out, as an office team, but I think often with predatory lending, very similar to the housing market, right? Where you have these new people of color that are new to the world of buying a home. And someone says to you, sure, you can afford that, right? And that's essentially what's happening in these pet stores, is that people are being unfortunately tricked into schemes that they didn't even know existed. And so it's a horrible, horrible thing. But on the subject of adopted dogs, I'm going to show you my son. I'm going to share my screen. This is my hairy son, and this is Guapo, and we adopted Guapo from Santa Paula, and he's literally love of our lives, and I understand, and I think to a certain extent that it is true. There is systemic racism everywhere. That's what makes it systemic. There's no less racism, right, inside of a pet store, which is primarily owned by non-people of color, than there is in an adoption center. And so where we believe as an organization there's anecdotal evidence proving or suggesting that there is bias in the adoption process, there's also bias everywhere. And by the way, we have not proven that it's a fact. So we're currently working on a research study with the University of Tennessee to find out whether or not it is true that people of color are more or less likely to not be adopted to. But we feel like it's very likely to be true, but we also feel like it's probably just as likely that people of color are going to be mistreated or duped or tricked inside of a pet store, because systemic racism is everywhere. It's in our police forces, it's in our government, it is certainly in our pet stores, and it's certainly in our adoption centers. And so the way around systemic racism is not to avoid the good thing, right? Adoption is a good thing. You don't fix systemic racism by moving away from a good thing. You fix systemic racism by flooding adoption centers with people of color. So much so that the adoption centers and the rescues, I believe, will start to understand who they're dealing with, right? Because the more people we can send in, the more relationships we will build. We're not going to solve this problem by, well, I'll put it this way, right? To say to Rosa Parks, get off of the bus and go hitchhike, where you're going to be in more danger, right, is nonsense. The whole point wasn't to get African Americans off the bus in its entirety. It was to change the busing system, which is what CARE is doing, right? And so we don't want people to move away from adoption. We want people to adopt more, right? Because the more people of color that walk into an adoption center and say, this is who I am, this is what my family looks like, we love pets, we've always loved pets, the more relationships we're going to build. And that's the way we get past the sort of issues that are happening inside of shelters and rescues. What's happening inside of puppy mills and what's happening inside of pet stores, to me, is more akin, honestly, to slavery, right? Because you have this hideous process where people are on farms and forced to breed, right? And then cleaned up a little bit to go work in the big house, right? And sold to go work in the big house. And I've always seen pet stores and puppy mills as akin to that. And honestly, if slavery was still legal, who would be in charge of it? It would be the Department of Agriculture, right? The same department that is running puppy mills. So I think there's some lineage there that we have to think about, right? We need to move away from purchasing and move towards love and compassion. If you're looking for a furry friend, almost of any breed, you can find it in a shelter.
Wow, James. Okay, thank you so much. And honestly, that analogy like gives me shivers just thinking about the analogy that you just made. Thank you so much for your time and communicating with us about this issue. You know, you brought up so many points about how people of color can be taken advantage of within the system. And, you know, of course, pet stores themselves with offering these financing schemes, they really are taking advantage of that. I actually saw a stat the other day that said that Black households are about 50%, about half of all Black households are underbanked, whereas only 15% of white households are. So that's huge, and that just shows like how these families are really being taken advantage of within the system. And of course, pet stores are part of that by offering these types of financing schemes and plans. I would like to know, just after hearing about this legislation and what's going on around the country, is this a type of legislation that CARE supports?
Oh, absolutely. I think anything, anything that is based in true consumer protection, which I believe this is equitable, is anti-racist. And that is the problem, I think, in so many spaces in this country, is that often people don't understand how vulnerable people of color are. It's been estimated anyway, that it would take 200 and some 30 plus years for the average Black family to arrive at the financial status of the average white American family. So there is, and I live this every day, there is no safety net, right? I am the safety net for my parents. There is no safety net for me. I can't go to my mom and dad for a loan. That's not true for everyone of color, but it is primarily true. We are that generation that is creating safety nets for my nieces and nephews and for my daughter's children, but that does not exist under me right now. And so if I were to go into a store and be bamboozled and be stuck with a $5,000 bill or a $10,000 bill for a pet that I love, but a pet that's more likely to be dying than anywhere else, that to me, that's just horrendous. It reminds me of smoking cessation. In my previous life, along with anti-puppy mills, we've done anti-smoking cessation, anti-gun violence. And it also reminds me of smoking cessation and how the tobacco industry has targeted communities of color with every type of cigarette product that's imaginable. And I think puppy mills and pet stores are part of that same process, just like the predatory lending. Not to be political, but that's what I loved about Elizabeth Warren. And not just her run for president, but her career in government has always been about defending consumers. And I think as taxpayers and general consumers, that's what we need more than anything. Big business is buying up government, big business is buying up legislation, and in buying those things, consumers are completely disenfranchised. And so any legislation, I think, that can put consumers in a place where we have some protection, it covers everyone. And by the way, there's nothing in this legislation that I've read that suggests that people of color can't go to responsible breeders, right? And so,
Exactly.
I mean, and then there's always that, right? And there's adoption, and then there is responsible breeding. But between the two, there is no real reason to go into a pet store, because there are lots of responsible breeders who love their animals. And we always encourage people to go to the breeder, develop a relationship, see the mother and the father, see the full property, and do a tour, and come back multiple times, and don't rush to bring a family member into your house. This is something that, I mean, I don't even know how to explain it. Like, Guapo is the glue that holds this house together, because he is the only the only being in this household that is incapable of lying, incapable of pretending to be something that he's not. And we're all, it's sort of like silently learning from him, and we waited 3 weeks for him to get here because he was in California, and we thought that he might be dying of parvo. Um, so when they told us that he wasn't dying of parvo, that he tested, it was a false positive. I mean, we ran out and we bought everything he needed, and then we had to wait 3 weeks. But those 3 weeks passed, and it was okay. Um, and the kids were all a part of it, and I wouldn't have had it another way. It was the best thing.
Yeah, yeah. And thank you for sharing his story, because I love hearing stories about furry family members, and he sounds just so special.
He's the smartest, sweetest thing ever.
Well, again, I want to say thank you, James. I'll speak for myself, coming from a place of privilege. Hearing your expertise and hearing what you have to share about this issue is really, really eye-opening for me. And I'm just so thankful that you're willing to sit down and help educate us on this type of legislation, and the equity issues that can be involved with pet adoption and purchasing and working with pet stores. So thank you so much. I'll leave it to Mindy to say last few words.
I just wanted to thank you for your emotional labor today. Like, you didn't have to take the time to talk with us. And I know that Bailing Out Benji and Care have a history together, and I'm so thankful for that, relationship. But thank you for letting us see this through your lens. Again, we do come from a place of privilege when we're working on this legislation, and never in our thought process did we think that it would wrongly target people of color. So thank you so much for your help today.
Yeah, you're welcome. I appreciate you guys. You're doing great work. I can't, like, there's only so much we can do, and then the other, just nice knowing that other people are doing that other thing. And by the way, that's Guapo right there.
Ah.
But God bless you. Good luck. Let me know if you need me. But don't let anybody twist this into being some sort of racially motivated thing. I think that's utterly ridiculous. And I think it's also important to bring as many people of color voices into the conversation as possible. But I think anyone in this industry that knows what puppy mills and pet stores are capable of would have no problem with this legislation. There's nothing about it that's racist. I think it's just the opposite.
All right. Well, thank you so much, James, once again.
Well,